Welcome to Recombination Nation. So, I rebranded this program with a new name because I wanted to talk to people interested in cultural evolution. And today's guest is a perfect match for that. Rogers Bacon is an evolutionary biologist who has developed a side passion for cultural evolution, and he writes about that on Substack at his Secretorum. So I'd highly recommend you check that out. But that's my quick introduction. Roger, do you want to tell us a bit more about your journey through life and what got you interested in the potential for studying cultural evolution?
Yeah, certainly. So I grew up right near Washington, D.C., and I went to Catholic school my whole life. Actually, all boys Catholic schools, a very common thing in the area where I grew up. And so I guess as an angsty, rebellious teenager, I found Richard Dawkins and the whole kind of new atheist movement, and I was just, so enthralled to, rebel against my Catholic education. And then, from there, I think I found, it's like, oh, Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, and I read The Selfish Gene, and it was just sort of love at first sight. And then, I went on to just, study genetics and evolutionary biology up until, I got a master's degree studying those things. And then I pivoted and I became a high school or secondary school teacher, biology. And, that was obviously really central to just, my sort of teaching philosophy and what I really wanted to, impart an evolutionary worldview to my students. And, I think you find, obviously, you're a teacher, you're trying to always make things relatable. I just found it was always funny and interesting when we could use cultural evolution. I'd be like, guys, you see, you already know about this. This is how memes evolve. In fact, do you know where the word meme actually comes from? It's from an evolutionary biologist. Excuse me. And then I think Shane, you first learned about me and we connected through, as you mentioned, I just, I've always been deeply inspired by intellectuals, philosophers, writers, and Substack, really changed the game, and I decided to get in and just start writing, and that has been a sort of personal cultural evolution over the last 5 years of me just, constantly exploring new ideas in my writing. Um, and I guess another sort of related project is I founded a scientific journal called Seeds of Science. There's a whole backstory with that, but as the name might imply, the focus was to make a very non-traditional type of scientific journal that was much more explicitly focused on the speculative and exploratory sides of things. These sort of half-formed ideas that might, form the seed of some new scientific flowering. Um, so I think, this will very much come through in our discussion. I'm very interested in, exploring ideas, however speculative or radical, and I would quite like being wildly wrong, but perhaps interesting, or in some way useful.
What is that? All models are wrong, but some of them are interesting. Okay, so a general starter question. What do you see as the potential value of speculating about the future of cultural and spiritual evolution? And are there any particular practical outcomes that you're aiming for?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think we're gonna get into this, but why even speculate on the future of religion 500 years from now? Or, how will people worship, people in quotation marks, how will entities worship, and what will they believe, in the year 3000? It's very easy to just dismiss it as science fiction, and the people won't be wrong to think that this is just an exercise in uselessness, but it's an exercise in imagination, perhaps purely for the sake of imagination and creativity. And I think still there is tremendous value in that. It's I think obvious to most people that perhaps more than ever, there are just incredible forces towards groupthink and conformity and playing it safe intellectually. In science, there's the publisher perish culture, and you can't afford to go on some wild goose chase or publish something that's going to look bad on your record, because I mean, in science and in every field, it's incredibly competitive, and that just leads to a kind of conservatism. Um, so I think this all kind of, to me, it's there is just an incredible pressure in for everyone to only think about the useful. We're constantly monitoring ourselves. Am I just is this going to help me in some way, advance my career, my life? Am I just spinning my wheels? Am I just, is this self-indulgent? How we feel we have to justify almost every thought towards some end. And I think in the over the longer term in our lives and civilizationally, that becomes just incredibly pernicious. And I'll put it as a metaphor. We have two different people. We have one who has a garage, and he is just ruthless about throwing things out, and he wants to keep his garage incredibly clean. If there is some old piece of equipment that he's like, I can't imagine that I'll use this again, it's just taking up space, or like, well, why would I even keep this? It's immediately getting thrown out. Versus, the person whose garage is full of old junk, things that are broken, things that again, he can't imagine he'll ever use again. Uh, but then all of a sudden something happens, and you need to improvise, or there's some crisis, or I need to fix or build something, and whose garage becomes more useful? The one that is full of all this useless junk, which very quickly has become useful. So I think we wildly overestimate our ability to know what is truly useful and useless.
Hmm.
And so all these useless strains of thought, just, spiritual fiction, this just me just wondering about what people will think about 1,000 years from now, or, just kind of metaphysical speculation. It might never cash out, or it might be, as I said, it might be wrong, but in an incredibly generative way. And even though it's metaphysical, it can inspire the physical, as the history of science shows, where there's just been this very dynamic interplay between the sort of religion, and the even more mystical side of things has always been in dialogue with science and politics, and the more sort of useful and grounded areas of human activity.
You definitely see a parallel between biological and cultural evolution, that it often comes down to improvising and cobbling together elements of pre-existing systems in unexpected ways, but you need to have that junk DNA handy
Mhm.
to play around with. If you've only got like exactly the genes that worked perfectly yesterday, you've got very little room to move to come up with new things for the future.
So, I mean, like you point out, I mean, there's a perfect biological comparison here. There is prokaryotes, where selection is incredibly ruthless, and the competition is so intense. If you have this stray gene that's not helping you, or this mutation that doesn't prove useful, like immediately it's going to get, natural selection is so efficient. It's like, the garage that we can't tolerate any junk,
Mm,
versus, we know about eukaryotes. It's just like half of human DNA is just ancient viral junk. But it does get co-opted and, improvised and thrown together into very complex new adaptations. So
hmm
it's a perfect metaphor.
mm. I also would get your perspective on practical cultural experimentation is something that has a really low barrier to entry. All you need is people, and maybe just yourself. Like you can do self-experimentation with culture and religion, and many people do that. They call it like, spiritual development and meditation, or self-improvement. Or you can get a group of people together to do it, and then have that extra complication of the dynamic. Do you think that's a fair thing to point out?
Totally. And so, kind of going back to the previous question, like, what is the value of all of this? I think we are in general, we have lost a kind of spiritual ambition. People are incredibly ambitious, economically, politically, nowadays, but back in the day, way back in the day, there's that joke, it's like the Jesus is the greatest startup founder of all time. And I think there's some kind of truth to that where, if you were incredibly ambitious and you were just some peasant, or just this like farmer 2000 years ago, well, you started talking and you said, I've come up with these new ideas, this new way of thinking about, the most fundamental aspects of reality. And I believe it, that if we follow this, we should live in a different way, a way that is more morally righteous, that is more conducive to flourishing. And you tried to get people on board with that. And,
Hmm
in the grand scheme of things, like you're saying, that was just a sort of radical cultural uh, experiment. You were, in essence, we might call this a cult, but you were trying to start a new culture, just de novo from scratch. And I think we'll get into this. For lots of reasons, people don't really aspire to do that. Serious people, they might explore a lot, like you said, their kind of own personal spiritual development, but it's looked at more as, on an individual thing, and it's maybe very kind of inwardly focused. It's, this is where you get into the kind of like secular Buddhism, mindfulness. It again, even though the whole aspect of it is that it should be sort of useless, you are now meditating to optimize your attention span and that whole kind of thing.
Mm. I have a question just quickly off the top of my head. The what do you think about the idea that the difference between a religion and a cult is its cultural visibility? With the idea that a religion is so pervasive that you don't even realize it's the water that everyone is swimming in. But as soon as enough people get an outsider view on a spiritual practice or a worldview or whatever, then it becomes a cult because it's small enough to kind of see from the outside.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. I mean, you know, even for the most sort of spiritual person today, I mean, the dominant paradigm is, materialism, secular materialism.
Mm,
There is essentially almost no such thing as sort of true spirituality. It has to be the sort of secular Buddhism. It ends up, spirituality is just psychologized.
hmm
And I think even for, to put my cards on the table, I'm, not a materialist. I believe in, some version of the soul, of the divine, and all of that. The waters you are swimming in are this, materialist paradigm. and it's I think I heard it once. It's like you're always looking over your shoulder at other people's beliefs, even if you are so sure that you have received divine inspiration and you have to share it from the world. It's not like it was when the sort of default paradigm was the where we're in a disenchantment versus enchantment. So there is a sense in which we are, you just by virtue of being a modern person, you are going against this, you are swimming through this dense invisible medium, and I think that is very discouraging, and I think it does lend people to I have all these beliefs, but why should I expect other people to care? That was just not how people thought, in the enchanted age.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that's totally getting at your question, but I think, a cult, I guess, so I think I sort of agree with your fundamental point, whereas just when you are, a cult in some sense, I think it obviously has a very pejorative sense nowadays, and it's
Hmm.
very easy to think of all the examples where it has gone horribly wrong. But if we there's different ways of thinking about, obviously it's what do we really mean by a cult? When people immediately think of the totalitarian, authoritarian kind, you are isolated from the outside world. But the positive gloss is kind of going back to this cultural evolution frame. A cult is a group of people who are going on an expedition to an unknown region in the landscape of ideas.
Hmm.
um, and it is a radical cultural experiment that in potentiality could form the basis of a new civilization. I
Hmm.
mean, the grandest scales, this is no different, obviously, than what, Buddha or Jesus did. Um, and so I don't know, I'll put that to you, I guess. But
Well, that's a good place to transition to talking about one of your articles I really loved on Substack about how cults went through a kind of golden age in the 70s and that the rate of formation of new cults has dropped off to basically zero. And yeah, I wonder if you could see that dynamic changing again in the future. Could the digital age provide new tools to allow people to create cults via different mechanisms?
so maybe a kind of grander idea here that I think about constantly in terms of thinking about the future is I fundamentally believe that history is a helix. There is a linear, progressive dimension, but there is a cyclical aspect, and so it spirals as it ascends. And so we find the past rhyming with the future, as people say.
Mm.
And I think there is, it's already starting to happen, and I'm not alone in this. There are lots of kinds of weird ways where uh, we are starting to return to a maybe hunter-gatherer or animist world, or just all kinds of ideas and social patterns from the past are going to come back with a remix.
Hmm.
And so I've heard people say sort of, there has been a mass return to oral history or oral culture, rather, recently, with the rise of podcasts for one, but just all this video content, um, and there is maybe a sense I could see in which the rise of AI just so pollutes the written medium that there becomes it's hard to it's just it's hard to trust. There's so much fake information. We have no idea who's writing anything. It's just people start to sort of lose a trust in the written word, and we do see actually sort of a return to people really valuing this, the immediate spoken word.
Mm,
You could see in the arts, for example, it's like any art that becomes easy for AI to do just becomes a little bit devalued. And it's never been a better time to be a stand-up comedian. Or I think I don't know if people feel like theater is coming back, but it's, that is the most immediate and human form. So I don't know. I'd be maybe I'll just I'd be curious what you to think there. Is there this sort of kind of future past? Are there any other trends you can think of where just like the ways of the ancients are returning in a digital medium almost?
well, to follow up that idea with the degradation of the open internet because of AI generated content and algorithmic feeds, I wonder if you agree that you can see a kind of digital Amish movement where people form like walled gardens of communities that try and exclude all of that useless information and to form more meaningful connections with a smaller number of people. On places like Discord, for example, I think that it might be starting to happen.
Most certainly, and I think that's where I was kind of going with that because that's the more sort of ancestral way of life. It's incredibly, excuse me, local. You don't know what's going on over that mountain, and you're not maybe particularly concerned with it.
Mm.
So I think people will move. I don't know if it'll necessarily be Amish in the sense that it's anti-technology, but I think people will um yeah, turn towards a kind of localism, kind of digitally and physically. Just and this this you could say is we're already seeing these just waves of populism around the world. That's, I think, sort of related to this. That's the bigger.
Mm. Well, what
Yeah.
one problem I see, and this is like a classic thing of cults in the pejorative sense, that they have high exit costs, that followers basically get trapped in that social network, and sometimes with, coercion or threats of violence or psychological manipulation, it's very hard for them to leave that group. And that is at least one of the ingredients that ensures the longevity and the stability of the cult until it blows up. But I think with the digital sphere, the entry costs and exit costs are so low that it's very difficult for structures to form. It's almost like imagine all the cells in your body were basically free to break off and join someone else's body anytime you pass them in the street. It would be very difficult to form a coherent identity as a person if your boundaries are always being renegotiated.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think what you saw in a lot of the 60s and 70s cults was just it was very easy to become so isolated that you had no idea that other people thought this was a cult. You had no idea how insane people thought what you were doing was. But now you're saying, you might be pulled into something, and we should say these cults still do exist, but I think lots of times people do a Google search and are like, is this a cult? And you'll see, oh, actually, some people have accused this of being a cult, and there was this case in the past where somebody was coerced, and you're like, oh, maybe I won't join this community. Um, so I mean, I think the overall dynamic will have to necessarily be different. Um, how that manifests is interesting to think about. I mean, in some sense, I think I think it will be in like the Amish, as you're saying, in that it's much more self-conscious. Like, I am succeeding from the mainstream culture, from globalism. It's not working for me. It is a polluted, sinful, terrible environment. I'm not getting value from that. I am going to try take a leap of faith and go in on this radical spiritual social experiment. And I sort of understand that this requires a great deal of buy-in and commitment that might almost be coercive, but there might also be an element of I'm tying myself to the mast because what was that? Is that the Odyssey or something
Yes,
where
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So there might just be, and this is maybe a broader theme too, that, like you're maybe seeing this with like cosplay and LARPing, the sort of self-conscious adopting of identities from fiction, from whatever, and maybe is maybe kind of unserious at first, but it evolves into something very serious quickly, and in sort of new surprising ways. And so I think going back again, this cultural there are hills and there are valleys. This is maybe one way of framing it. And you can stay in the mainstream culture and you're on a hill and well, I have tradition behind me, and well, there's a lot of people, and it seems like this is a good way of thinking and living. And but maybe individually and collectively, you're trapped on a local optima. You think you're on the biggest mountain range, but you don't know there are other mountain ranges where there are more beautiful and more true forms of living and knowledge. But to get there, you're going to have to go through a valley where it might, people are going to tell you you're crazy, you're going against the grain, and you might have to, really make some sacrifices. Like, ultimately, obviously, this is we could talk about the sort of sacrificial dimension is inherent to spirituality, and you're not going to be able to start this experiment, this cult, whatever you want to call it, unless there is, really, sort of deep sacrifice on the part of individuals and groups.
Hmm. I also wonder, like, with pre-internet era cults, people had to be in the same physical location, which increased the buy-in costs and the exit costs and created a more stagnant dynamic. But with digital cults, there's no, you could potentially be a member of multiple cults simultaneously through your device. And it's your online behavior that proves your commitment and membership in any of those cults. But the individual cults have to provide enough of a benefit to retain their members rather than, just being a 5 mile walk away from the nearest bus stop that, discourages people from leaving. So I wonder if that could actually be a more healthy dynamic, that whatever these structures become, they have to offer some kind of ongoing tangible benefit to retain membership.
So this is all very abstract, but maybe one example we could kind of work through is QAnon,
Hmm.
which people have certainly accused of being a cult, but really all it was, I guess I don't know, it seemed to have peaked a few years ago, was somebody posting on a forum and just posting about these crazy conspiracy theories, and Hillary Clinton was eating babies. And I mean, it was sort of religious in the sense that it was an entire worldview that you had to buy into, and this mysterious QAnon person, was this sort of prophet who would post these anonymous messages, and they would say this thing's going to happen in the real world, and people, there were real world consequences, and this very much played a role in the sort of January 6th insurrection, and with Donald Trump and all. But to your point, it wasn't binding in any real sense. Uh, Beyond it just, if you bought in, you were buying into a very us versus them worldview, and you can't trust the mainstream media. And so it sort of, I guess it sort of informationally controlled people, which is
Mm.
very different than physically, obviously.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, here's the other thing, like the tangible benefits from achieving membership in something like a digital cult. I wonder. I mean, one possibility is to collectively curate the internet experience, that you could pool your resources and attention to locate and share quality information on the internet rather than just trying to navigate that as a lone individual who's constantly getting sucked into time wasting with algorithmic viral slop.
Right. Yeah, and I think, that's kind of what it's like, pre-internet and going back in history, there was the fog of war, just the unknown. There was the here be dragons on the map, and that's returning, but it's we know too much, and it's too much for any one person to ever trace down every claim. So it's just we still don't know what's going on, but it's not from lack of information.
Mm,
And so I think, yeah, that's a really powerful dynamic that, like you're saying, I think people will increasingly try to solve with sort of just, seceding from the mainstream.
mm. I had a question about do you think custom trained LLMs could function as charismatic leaders to bring cults together? And they've got a few advantages. They're immortal, effectively. You could avoid a lot of the self-interest that, fallible, horny humans tend to fall into when they get power over other people. And potentially unlimited scalability. Like one human cult leader might be able to manage 100 or 1,000 people if they've got good middle management, but LLMs could scale potentially indefinitely. Like,
Um,
could the next
so I
Bible be an LLM?
Right. So first thing I would say, I mean, a lot to unpack there. First thing I would say is, again, this is another example of, the return of the past. I mean, from, the beginning of Chat GPT and these LLMs, the obvious comparison has been, it's like summoning a demon,
Mm,
or you're sort of talking to, a collective ghost of all human writing almost. It's very much these things are very much like the digital manifestation of spirits and gods and things like that. It is very much like a genie, as
mm,
people have said. So it's in prompt. Well, what is prompting but casting a spell,
mm,
as many have remarked. Um, but more to your question, I've had this funny thought, and I think we're not far away from this happening, where there will be streamers that are just it's an LLM, it's all AI generated, and they will present themselves as real people, and it might be sort of impossible to tell if at some point we will have no idea if this streamer is a real person. um and I for all the reasons you said, I think there's really no reason that these LLMs, these AIs, couldn't start developing their own ideologies and philosophies, and perhaps I mean, who knows what the future holds, but there will probably have to be a human in the loop for some time to add to the creativity and just kind of manage all of it, obviously.
mm,
um, but I guess I have a sense that it'll be, I don't know, it'll happen in a very surprising way. I don't think we will get self-conscious worship of AIs on any, there'll always be the one-off, these AI psychosis that people are already
mm.
falling into. But I
Yeah, well,
just I
that's exactly what it could be like. It would be group
yeah.
psychosis around a particular LLM.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I don't think it's implausible. I guess I just still am a little skeptical of it to truly produce like novel thinking
Mm,
necessarily.
mm.
Um, maybe someday it will, but
Well, another topic, you linked the 1970s golden age in cult formation possibly to access to psychedelics. And we seem to be moving into a psychedelic renaissance as the legislation that shut all of that down is starting to be reversed around the world. So, where do you see that tool potentially coming into things? And it's worth pointing out that, like, even early Christianity seemed to have a psychedelic ritual as part of in inducting people into the church.
yeah, certainly. And that, obviously just was widespread in the ancient world. You had, all kinds of cults whose, most sacred sacrament involved some kind of psychedelic or, mind altering experience. I mean, one possibility that just interests sort of and excites me is just, of course, there is the more natural and classical psychedelics. Uh, but I think we are, kind of at the dawn of an age of, biophysical exploration in general.
Mm,
People talk about transhumanism, of course, but there will be new drugs and new experiences, and there will be new cognitive modalities that are maybe pharmacological, but maybe it's also combined with some kind of technological enhancement or modification. And to the extent that these will create, like I said, like genuinely new states of mind, genuinely new experiences. This of course has been, people come back from these experiences with new ideas about reality, new ideas about everything, and these often do form groups that revolve around this experience and the ideas that come out of it. So, to the extent that, like I've been saying, I think we are just under exploring, in every facet of life and thought. I think these will happen, and they'll be tremendously generative on a kind of widespread cultural level.
mm, mm. Now, I think I sent you this question in advance. I hope you've heard of it. And this is. I'll get to it quickly. This is an idea that when I heard it, it instantly just lit up so many areas of my brain. So the theory is that humans evolved what's called a group aposomatic display, where basically all of the members of a tribe like sing and dance and move as one, probably to drive predators off prey. So imagine like, 30 hominins all singing and dancing and shouting like one giant animal, probably throwing rocks at the same time as they approached, dangerous creatures like lions that were guarding a wildebeest that they just brought down. And there's a theory that this is the origin for human dance and music and language and group identity formation, and probably how we learned to throw projectiles. But if this is the origin of like human eusociality, and it's something that we see tapped into in the formation of religions and cults, like singing in church, dancing in church is like almost universal. Do you think there's things that we can learn from that? And also, you can give someone a placebo and tell them it's a placebo, and it still works pretty much as well. And I wonder if that's true for want of a better word, like brainwashing of like f creating a group identity and feeling in a cult. And I'm thinking of like corporate team building exercises that everyone cringes over, but are designed to like manipulate group psychology. Do you think there's like opportunities in human biology that we have kind of only previously accidentally stumbled into that we could start using more deliberately?
Yeah, that's there's a lot there.
Hmm.
My mind goes in a lot of places. So, well, one thing is, so you talked about psychedelics. You know, to very quickly, we've, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've really sort of started to understand like what's going on a psychological and like neurological level. I don't know if you're, familiar with these like general ideas. It's been a lot of the work of Carl Friston and what's his name, Robin Carhart Harris, I believe his name is. But the general like there's a paper. It's called "Relaxed Beliefs Under." Stress, or it's stress, or psychedelic psychedelic states. And the general idea is that what psychedelics are doing is they are relaxing your beliefs, and beliefs here means sort of consciously held beliefs. And we know, psychedelics, they open your mind, and people start doing psychedelics and they become more spiritual, or their personalities change, and so that's part of it. But it also includes just these sort of unconscious priors that are sort of, just their beliefs. You had to learn them, but they're so ingrained, they're automatic, they're even perceptual. So, why do walls move sometimes when you're under the influence? Normally, you have just, you're inundated with visual information constantly coming in, and you need to, very rapidly identify and sort and filter and create this, coherent visual world. And there's too much information coming in, so you filter it with your unconscious priors. And so even if, out of the corner of the eye, it might look like the wall is moving, under normal states, you have such a strong prior, like walls do not move, that your mind just automatically edits that out and says, "Oh, that was just noise. Like, I assure you that that wall was not moving." And we can trick this all kinds of ways with optical illusions. But under psychedelics, you see that noise because you've relaxed that prior. And I don't know, maybe that tree is maybe it's not just kind of waving in the wind. It actually looked like it moved towards me, or that wall, so that's the general idea. So um and I also mentioned there's also this, I mean, they've traced it down, the same neurological mechanism that catalyzes this mass relaxation. It also happens under intense stress.
Mm.
And in one of the papers, they sort of point out that, why is this happens all, this has been, cultural evolution has always stumbled upon these sort of group ways of organizing and reinforcing group identity that usually involves some kind of trial or incredibly stressful experience. Why is boot camp, and for any
Mm.
army, designed to be incredibly stressful, and it kind of relaxes your beliefs and builds them back up into, I am a member of the army now. You're rewired in that sense. And so I think there is a, I don't know, that's one perspective where, I think actually, doing intensely difficult and choreographed things with groups of people is a sort of psychotechnology for rewiring your identity, and allowing the group to uh become something novel, and carry out these new behaviors that, certainly, we have cultural evolutionarily, we've stumbled on this, but biology has too, like you're saying, like, this might have been very core to the formation of modern, anatomically and psychologically modern humans.
Well, a related question. I've seen some people hypothesize that like newborn babies are effectively hallucinating for the first year or so of their life until things start to narrow down. And I wonder if there is a critical window of plasticity for group identity formation during adolescence. And it might even have an evolutionary basis because teenagers often move between different tribes in modern humans, that there's kind of cultures of swapping young people for marriages to prevent inbreeding. And yeah, I wonder if like high school cliques forming during that time in life is a reflection of that old capability, and that as we get older, our ability to form new group identities diminishes over time.
Yeah, well, one, I think you're totally right, and I have seen people sort of explain the effect of psychedelics as reducing you to a childlike state, and certainly anyone who's partaken will know exactly what that feels like, where you just feel incompetent
Hmm.
in many ways. Um, so I do think. Yeah, I mean, and so, I always like people, people talk about your taste in music, right? Like everybody's taste in music when they're 50 is the music they liked when they were, 18 and 20.
Mm.
Um, but I think it's very much the same thing with, identity and, who you see as your tribe, as you say. And, I think, a lot of all these sort of psychotechnologies are trying to break you down and in some sense bring you back to that, highly plastic state where you can be molded into something else. Um, it's interesting you bring this up. I mean, I think when I think about the again, if we're speculating long-term future or just, comparing to the past, I think one of the broadest shifts has been our culture is much more dominated by adults than it ever was in the past. We are
Hmm.
living longer. Um, Children have much less power than they probably ever have in culture, for lots of reasons. The world's more dangerous and complex. I mean, you could say the same thing with old people. I mean, relative to ancestral ways of life, the power of adults is much stronger relative to children and the elderly. The
Mm.
elderly, if they get passed by, through, the chain, this kind of rapid progress, in a way that, didn't happen even 100, 200, 500 years ago, of course. And that seems to me like that's only gonna, I mean, as sort of radical life extension technologies come on board and, we, whatever happens, we fuse with AI or we are able to, um, create sort of digital afterlife technologies where, our spirit can live on through every, word we've ever said or recorded or written or whatever. Um, there is going to just be this continual shift towards maturity. Um, and obviously, what we know about old people is they get stuck in their ways, they don't experiment, they don't change their mind. Um, so to me, it's hard not to think of that as a potentially problematic trend that we will need to counter, um, perhaps, consciously with, like you're saying, with psychedelics, with new technologies, or just sort of cultural adaptations that induce, greater amounts of neuroplasticity to counter this just kind of increasing elderliness of,
Mm.
of our thinking.
Well, that gets me to the next idea of the idea of a cult with a predetermined dissolution date and that could function almost like a festival. And I think if you look at traditional societies, there were these regular occasions where people got to put on different social identities and different social relations that came out of them, knowing that it was only for like a night or a week or something that people were permitted to behave and relate in very different ways from day to day life. And it almost makes me wonder if this ability to form new feelings of group identity is a muscle that you need to exercise repeatedly in life. And if you get stuck in, one social system for too long, it atrophies. So again, I'm throwing lots of ideas at you, but take that wherever you want.
All right, well, let me take that on a wild tangent that's, I think, very related. So, going along with what I just said, I like the Victorian era, I guess. There was all these anthropologists going out to, all their, places in Africa around the world, and there was a very, like racist way of talking about these tribal savages, and they would often, they would say that it's like childlike, like, they, are not as mature and enlightened as us moderns. Um, and that's, it was obviously, like I'm saying, racist, but there is a sense in which, the sort of pagan or like animist way of life is, it's very childly. The child, like we maybe sort of touched on, it's, you are not really making as much distinctions, as the mature adult and his just kind of overactive conceptual framework is constantly making. It's, very clear that this is alive and that's not alive, and this is nature and this is human. Whereas the hunter-gatherer animist sort of just lives in this web where all is alive and all is one, and they are very preoccupied with their myths and stories, and it's a very, they are sort of living in an imaginal world in a way that we just, we are not in secular modernity. Even the sort of monotheistic religions, it's not mythic, in the way like, these Native American tribe was.
Could I
Uh,
make a counterpoint though that us rational moderns spend a huge amount of our waking life in immersed in fictional worlds that we've kind of separated the two out, but we haven't completely discarded that mindset. We've just kind of built a wall around it and called it fiction.
100% true. Well, so you push back on this idea maybe, but I guess what was the thesis I was developing
Mm,
was, yeah, the human's sort of ancestral, I mean, even just your state of consciousness was much more akin to, a sort of childly modality, where, everything was much more physical. You weren't, as, abstract and as verbal even. It's just our, we are trained from birth in this scientific rationality, and we are, just dominated by the more cognitive aspects of our life. And, maybe to counter that, I mean, to your point, it's like we do need to put a firewall around. We can't suppress it, but we have infantilized it. We see, like, we think it's, childish if you're like obsessed with Disney as an adult, or,
mm.
or you're obsessed with Harry Potter, which, to I don't know, if you could say someone 2,000 years ago and explain to them that people are obsessed with Disney, they'd be like, yeah, I mean, we have our folk tales and myths too. Like, what? Yeah, like, duh. Um, so I don't know. That's a counterpoint. Maybe we can push a little bit more on this, and then I can. I was going to tie this back to your question about like the festivals and the group identity.
Was that all you wanted to say on that, or?
Well, I don't know if if you had any more like pushback or ways of, countering this sort of thesis. I'm saying that we, this more of ancestral childliness.
Well, I mean, you could maybe use Ian McGilchrist's left brain, right brain imbalances through changes in culture as a framework for looking at that.
I mean, I think that's, this is just another way of saying ultimately what he's saying.
Mm, mm,
But so I guess to take this back to your question, um, I immediately thought of, in the medieval Europe, these carnivals, or they called them, the feasts of misrule, or there was, the Romans had Saturnalia, and there were these festivals where there were these inversions of the social order.
mm,
And they would elect a boy bishop, or they would make the town fool would be king for a day.
mhm,
Excuse me. And, it was in a festive. It was like this is a special time of the calendar. There was an understanding that, we are going to go back to the regular way of things, but do you know that book, The Dawn of Everything?
Hmm.
David Graver, they talk about this. I mean, sometimes it didn't go back to the way it was, or that, the fact that the social order could be inverted created just a sense of possibility, a sense of, sort of cultural flexibility that was maybe latent for a while, but you could say that, in certain times and places, the inversion was maintained, or, because people obviously had the idea like, well, we have these festivals where we're all, or maybe not, that's a radical example, but you would have every culture would have festivals where regular hierarchies and traditions would break down, and there would be an eruption of this just sort of egalitarian celebratory spirit. um, and I think, I mean, that's a very playful, almost childish way of doing things. And like, to me, it's I mean, there, I don't know what would be even the again, it's not that we don't have festivals and holidays, but they are very firewalled, and
Mm.
they are kind of looked at as like, oh, this is not a real thing, in a way that it maybe wasn't back in the day, because it was more it was more related to the kind of wider religious context.
Yeah.
We have a religious holiday, but we're a secular culture, so that's just, whatever. Or we have Christmas, but it's not even really religious anymore. Like,
Yeah.
so I just think, to me, I would connect this to the broader, more adultliness of modern culture, where we are, just less able to tolerate serious play.
Yeah.
I would.
Well, along that theme, this is something I imagine would be useful in the future. Imagine a group of people came together to live in a share house, but just for like a weekend or a month, and they go in with the intention to live according to the rules of some cult that they've imagined, and they want to actually play through what it's like, but they know that there will be an end to it. So, you can kind of commit to the bit. I mean, I'm thinking of like the Stanford prison experiment almost in like a darker version of it. That it's like, what would
Yeah.
these rules? It's a bit like complexity theory. Like you never really know what the rules will play out like until you try and put multiple, complex psychological beings into motion.
Yeah, it's like we were saying before, the tying yourself to the mast,
Mm,
at least for a time. That's a really interesting concept. I mean, the one thing I think is like, people did this in the past, except the end date was the end of the world. But it often not all it often didn't come. And so um that's a really interesting concept, and I think is a great way of crystallizing, a lot of just all these themes I've sort of been talking about, where it is a sort of rational, self-conscious, self-directed cultural evolutionary experiment.
mm,
Um,
mm,
I mean, the one thing that I don't, like, there's all these, people are starting to try out these charter states and charter, cities and things nowadays. I mean, I think, the more powerful way of doing that almost is like starting a colony, right?
hmm
Then it's, you have 100% buy-in, and the sort of, kinetic energy, really gets expressed in, a kind of almost cultural do or die scenario. So it's like, I wonder, the critique might be like, how fully can people commit to the bit when it's like self-conscious, and we're going to this house versus we're moving to this island.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I think if you are doing it as a temporary exercise, you can afford to take much bigger risks and to explore space that you would never take a chance on if you're like, oh, we're building this and it has to last forever. If you go in with that mindset, building a new social structure, you have to be much more conservative about the risks that you take. But if you're like, oh no, it's just a group of 12 people for a week, and we're going to try out this really, crazy set of uh, principles, you might stumble onto something that on the face of it looks like it would never work, but in practice, it surprises people.
Right. And then you would think that that would fit very very well with the, like I said, the sort of self-directed transhumanism.
Hmm.
We're all gonna, yeah, go to this area for a month, and we're also gonna try out this, new neurotechnology which makes us radically empathetic, or just modifies our minds in some way. And it's a sort of collective psychocultural experiment in that
Well,
sense.
here's a suggestion for an even more mundane form of this cult experiment. What if everyone in the cult has their voice recorded and their location recorded the entire time, and all of that information is transcribed and put into like a central database that anybody can access and interrogate? So it's this idea of God, like, is it watching and judging everything that you do, so you have to be virtuous, but it is actually there. Anyone in the community will know everything that you've said and done.
And then Shane, you know what you do? You take all that data, you feed it into an LLM, and it
Hmm.
becomes the god of that cult,
Yeah, yeah.
which can represent and reproduce the patterns of thought and being that were sort of collectively manifested.
And it can manage conflict resolution as well, and like equitable allocation of work and tasks. It's something that's right there on our fingertips, and nobody's quite got around to playing around with it yet. Another thing I really want to ask you about, we seem to have a much better grasp on human psychological diversity these days. Can you see potential in psychometric testing to filter people coming into these groups? And like, can you imagine cults built around various forms of neurodiversity emerging in the future?
That's a good question. I think, yeah, I could see that. I mean, I think there's a taboo and a legal enforcement in many cases, that you can't even give IQ tests to people before hiring, for
Mm,
example, or your ways of assessing people for any application are write a personal statement, or just like they have to be, they can't be that sort of fine-grained and nitty-gritty,
mm.
with the exception of like when you're applying for the to work for the CIA,
Or the US military, I think, is the best long-running history of assessing individuals and then allocating them to the best place in a big organization.
but that's quite, they're more, yeah, sort of placing people and ruling people out. It's it's I guess a piece of what you're talking about, but you could imagine an even a highly targeted thing where we are a monastery who conducts scientific research, and we are filtering highly for people that work well, and used to create sort of psychological incubators, of that, explore cultural space in certain directions.
Mm, mm. Okay. Well, that gets me on to the next question, and I think a really good case study in history is Saint Benedict, who wrote a little how-to book for like how to make a monastery, and it became like a bestseller and spread monasteries all over Europe in a relatively short period of time. And I wonder if something similar could emerge in the 21st century, particularly as a response to the cost of living crisis among younger people who are like increasingly struggling to find like secure accommodation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've read people, the comparison has been made between, now we have today we have involuntarily celibates,
Mm,
because we don't really have voluntary celibates like we used to, as in, these celibate monks and things like that.
mm,
Um, so I mean, I think this fits with, whether it's, a kind of monastic form of life, or I think we will see, things where people get together and consciously isolate themselves for some goal, or because of, some belief they have. I'm kind of forgetting the God, I don't know if I have a great answer for this question. I'm forgetting where you went with it,
Oh,
besides just.
mostly just like the monastic movement in Europe in response to like the collapse of Rome, you could argue, I think is a model for something that could pop up in coming decades.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I mean, I think, uh well, as you know, I have predicted the fall of the United States, um or, rather, it's disillusion back into the states of America.
Hmm.
And I do think, again, this is, again, the rise of populism. I think there is a realization that, your local community and, just the what's around you it's the opposite of, the digital world and globalism, and that there are a lot of negative things to just having open society and open border and open everything. And I think we will continue to see more rejection of that, and a more just local turn in many respects. And I think, in my mind, this will be sort of more reinforced by just a much more multipolar geopolitical order.
Mm,
Um, where, perhaps you see, obviously, like, you'll have China on one end, which is about as centralized as you can get, and they will, expand their influence and their block. Um, but I think you might see many other regions. The 1900s were a time of very little geological reconfiguration,
mm.
unusually so compared to, historical precedent. So I think the bet would be that we will see much more annexation and dissolution and formation of new city states and polities. And I think, in the long run, that, it'll be chaotic and violent, but it will, as everything we've been talking about, it will allow for more socio-political experiments and innovation, hopefully.
Well, there's a question I probably should have asked a bit earlier, but I've been really interested in how historic religions like Islam and Judaism banned certain forms of media, such as visual representations of the human form. And I'm wondering if something similar could emerge with how people interact with the digital space. So, for example, banning the use of recorded music is one that's often brought up because it has such powerful emotional effects. And if you made music sacred and you only had like live music, or even stripping the internet experience back to just text and like all images are gone on the internet for people who adhere to that particular belief. It's kind of like a digital veganism.
Yeah. I mean, my mind goes in a lot of places, and I think it's, um, you know, I don't think this is apocryphal, but when at least like certain tribes of Native Americans first saw photographs, they reacted like, very negatively, and were like, I don't want any part of that. And I think, talking to them, there was sort of a belief that an image, especially one that was, such high fidelity, is like stealing a part of your soul.
Mm,
Uh, and it's hard not to look at the way that social media and has just warped people's sense of self, and just bred just virulent narcissism and egotistical behavior. It's hard not to see some truth in that we're not the ability to just capture these images and idols of yourself. They warp your sense of self, and if you're not prepared for it, ultimately damage it.
Mm,
um so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and there would be I don't think it is incredibly far-fetched for like you brought up with the music example, where people recognize that like recorded music is just this like super stimuli that uh speaking of cults, as we have been, you get things like a cult following for some musical acts, and certainly
Beatlemania.
Deadheads, these Grateful Dead fans that just essentially gave up their entire lives to do psychedelics and just follow the band like some kind of modern like nomads, essentially,
Mm,
and in many cases like ruined lives. Um, well, all that is to the point that like our you know our fundamental relationship to media and art is very today, where we don't, first of all, it's completely secularized, whereas obviously, going back in history, it was sort of seen as anything you produce is, ultimately not from your hand. There's some form of divine inspiration. Almost everything was, religious or spiritual art of some kind, and it was seen as either contributing to worship, or was an act. The act of creation was a form of worship. um we take all forms of art and media very lightly today, in a way that, like I'm saying, people in the past just didn't.
mm,
And I could see, I brought up the example earlier of, as AI becomes just more and more competent at all of these things, uh, do they become cheapened? Is there this kind of counter reaction where, yeah, we start to see, the ability to stand in front of people and act or entertain as, the only true forms of art? I mean, anyone can, record a movie, who know, or, anyone can, write something, who knows, but can you give a speech? You know,
mm.
um, that would be a really interesting consequence to me, and perhaps a plausible one.
Mm, mm. Now on the cultural evolution, I have one really final big question. How do you think the place of sex and death and reproduction could change, could transform in the next 100 years? Because if you look at surveys of young people, they seem to be losing interest in sex and reproduction in a way that a lot of demographers and politicians and economists are getting terrified about. But at the same time, we have like endless pornography. Um, and also the attitude towards death seems to be changing rapidly as well too. And I'm looking at acceptance of voluntary euthanasia probably becoming the norm by the time I'm old.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, one thing, most of us moderns are so detached from, the natural modality, the state of nature already, and it's hard not to see that only accelerate. People are leaving rural areas at record paces. It's like, well, 50 100 years from now, there's such a massive fraction of the world's population will just be living in solely man-made environments, to say nothing of our how much time and energy we spend in the digital world.
Mm.
um do we see a a sort of sacralization of these core natural processes of death and sex and procreation, where they just start to take on a different sort of valence. And like, so for example, again, if people are living longer and longer, and we are sort of we have the option to take control of death in more ways, or does that start to feel very different? Do people start to see value in letting death play out naturally? This is a kind of a sort of movement like neo-romantic or primitivist movement, where we just start to really value these things even more, even things that seem like sort of the dark side of nature that we try to control and run away from, like death. I mean, I I could definitely see. I mean, it's obviously, as everyone knows, like we're just no one is exposed to death. Certainly not human death. Most of us in just our typical life.
Mm.
And is this good for us? Is this bad for us? Do people start to see a cultural importance in us? Worshiping death might be far, but just it is. Do people start exploring new ways of thinking about these things, like you're saying?
Mm. I think
Yeah,
you were
that
talking about the Mexican cult that's sprung up. What is it? What's the name?
Santa Muerte.
Santa Muerta. Yeah.
Which I only recently learned about this, but it is now up to 12 million followers in like the last 15 years. So it's actually the fastest growing new religious movement in the Americas, and one of the fastest in the world. And it's centered around the worship of Our Lady of Holy Death, and she's looks like the Virgin Mary, but with a skull for a face and a sickle. And it's, as far as I understand, I'm just, I read the Wikipedia page and a few articles. It's sometimes it's wrapped up in Catholicism. Some people are trying to make it its own sort of church and belief system.
Mm.
Uh, but it is, very much just a bringing of death into life, into, people's just kind of daily activities. Which it's hard not to see the benefit of that. Of course, there's all kinds of ancient, stoic and contemplative techniques where you meditate on your death, right?
Mm. I mean, it's syncretism like happening in the field. You could like go out and take measurements of it as it's unfolding.
Oh, 100%.
Um, Now, I saw an interesting quote that at the heart of all great religions is a mystery. And I wonder, like, what mysteries are left to build religions around. I mean, death is obviously one of them, but can you see any other new possibilities that have kind of recently come on the scene? Or is it just the old classics?
Um, well, that's a great question, obviously. Um, you know, it seems to me, and maybe this is me wish casting, but I think it's this sort of interconnected monoculture that modern media and the internet and everything has created. They're more than ever before. Obviously, we there is, in a sense, one world culture, and that has really, supported and reinforced the sort of dominant materialist paradigm, like we talked about.
Mm,
No matter how spiritual and religious you are, like we said, there's the kind of the burden of proof is on you,
mm,
and you are always you're always mindful. You're, like I said, you're looking over your shoulder. You're thinking, you are forced to, rationalize your beliefs in a way that, obviously, people in the pre-modern world, just it didn't even cross their mind that I needed to justify that, uh, you know, all of reality is supported by a divine being, or what have you,
Mm,
or that of course everyone has a soul. That's just not even up for debate. It wouldn't even occur to me that this is something that has to be argued for. Um, everything we've been talking about, where if there is this movement towards just a general fracturing of this monoculture, and there's more groups just kind of opting out and sort of purposefully and consciously seeking isolation, even if, like we talked about, even if just for a brief time.
mm,
Um, well, then I think you will start to get, again, this you will get cultural areas where a sort of unreflective, incredibly strong belief in an, you know, panpsychism, or just some non-materialist paradigm, just gets taken as the water we swim in. And
mm,
so in that sense, obviously, I think that we are never going to solve the mystery of consciousness with a scientific theory.
hmm
So to me, that is the fundamental mystery, which is really only which it's not a problem to be solved. It is a true mystery.
hmm
And so flowing from that, you have the mystery of free will, which again, I don't think it is a problem. That will never, accurately, come up with a theory of free will. I don't believe that, materialism or science has proved that we are just these, automatons with just these atoms bouncing around in us like billiard balls. I could go on. Um,
Well, it
but
makes
I
me
think,
think of the idea of cultural schismogenesis, that like tribe A observes the habits of tribe B and makes themselves as extremely different from that to form a distinct cultural identity. And the example that comes to mind with this, with scientific rationalism being the default, is the flat Earth people who seem to delight in like poking their tongue out at the established way the world is supposed to work by saying, no, we think the planet is flat instead of round. And it's like such a bold and ridiculous claim that it gives them a kind of, a childish delight in that rebellion. And I think there's parallels with Christianity using the cross as a way of like putting that symbol of oppression and terror like back in the face of the Romans and saying, no, we like this. This is our power that you gave us.
yeah, I mean, it's the arguably the most fundamental human force, and like you kind of like it is oftentimes, if not, people wouldn't admit this, but it's very childish. And you could maybe tie this back into what we were saying about our culture is very serious, and so this like either doesn't happen, or it's we're not it's not sort of it doesn't catch on in a way that, yeah, in the past, like, I guess where I was going with your original question is, if, once we are back in a world where people are not taking materialism very seriously, uh, then we start understanding mystical experiences in a very different way. We start actually taking them seriously and not just dismissing them as, you were hallucinating, or, oh, well, that's just, it was it just was this like thing that happens in consciousness, or, it's not actually real. And, of course, this is how most religions and cults started. There was a person who had some experience. They said, I learned something, God told me this. And oftentimes they brought back some genuinely new way of thinking, or some new moral code. And there was this idea of charisma. These people, they became, in some cases, morals. People saw that they were transformed.
Mm.
They were not who they were before, and they became kind of moral saints or spiritual superheroes. Where they were all of a sudden they were, fasting for 40 days and standing on pillars for a year and preaching and doing all these things. And that was, real evidence that, if not touched by God, something has happened here. And, maybe we should take this person seriously. Um, and so if you do see, like I'm saying, this, re-enchantment, at least in certain communities, this sort of re-mystification and of the world, that will start happening. And you will see, charismatic spiritual leaders, arising as they did throughout antiquity, I would expect.
Could you see something like a syncretism between science and religion happening in the next 100 years? And I would maybe point to Scientology as one example of that that's already kind of past its peak. But even characters like Rupert Sheldrake, I think, could be an interesting example of that possibility of people from a in many ways scientific background and perspective, like delving into the mysteries in science, like all the places where it falls down and doesn't work, and embracing them in a way that mainstream science has been unable to do.
Um, yeah, it's hard to imagine what that would look like. I mean, there are, like, Scientology's one, example, which is, that is very obviously a cult in the sort of totalitarian strain, as, what people think of in the, pejorative sense.
Hmm.
Um, it just it seems to me, obviously, like a lot of people have, sort of tried this, or, you have the creationist or like intelligent design people that are like, no, science actually does support religion
Hmm.
and all of this. And, to me, it's just, or you have scientism, which is an unacknowledged religion. To me, it just comes down to, are or scientists dogmatically embracing materialism? Because if so, then I mean, yeah, it fundamentally is incompatible with religion.
Hmm.
um you just, if you are a dyed in the wool materialist scientist, you can't admit that mystical experience is what the experiencers say it is.
Hmm.
You have to dismiss it as a hallucination, a malfunction. Oh, we can trace it to the, what happened in the brain. So in that sense, it's like, there's no way to me that you're going to be too skeptical. It doesn't fit into your worldview. You can't acknowledge that there is an outside of, physical reality, and that it can intervene and supervene on this world in ways that we should pay attention to, and make something of. So, if people are more willing to get by, there are tons, like you brought up Rupert Sheldrake, there are tons of scientifically trained and, scientifically educated people who think like what I'm describing, but they're not in academia. Like,
Hmm.
the academic superstructure, and, and the wider public culture, these, you can't be this kind of person. You'll be shunned. Um, if that starts to break down, then I could see these things, but I just sort of see, as I've been saying, a return of future past, and it will rhyme. People won't just go back to animism. It will be cyber animism, and people will say,
I love that.
actually everything is alive because we can put an AI in literally everything, and actually we should do that. And maybe these people will also be panpsychists who develop, philosophical theories about how atoms are alive, and they treat that as a very live hypothesis. Like, they're like, no, 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 we'll actually prove this one day, and that is, the thrust of their sort of spiritual scientific exploration. I don't know. I'm thinking aloud here, but
Well, another point of cultural schismogenesis I could see would be groups that embrace radical inequality and hierarchy. Like the modern secular ideal is that everybody is equal and to some degree interchangeable. But I wonder if that could be a point of differentiation of groups that reject that idea and actually embrace a much more structured social system.
I I mean I would think that you will see just a, an explosion of every I put like every way of thinking, ideology, spirituality, social organization will find a home in some city state or tribe and be scaled up and intensified, and it will evolve further in surprising ways. And it seems to me like you would almost definitely have contrary to the recent protests in the US, there will be kings, not no kings. There will be kings and god emperors, and it will be monarchies and all of this, and it will be good, bad, weird, and and all of the above.
I'm also curious, like you're a bit of a doober as well, with regards to the future, that there's a lot of chaos ahead. And have you given any thought to what the cultural impact to the degradation and loss of the internet could be? Because it's a very
So
complex and fragile machine that's like constantly breaking and needing expensive repairs to keep it going. And yeah, I wonder if it's like this tide that's kind of drowned world cultures. But at some point, that tide's likely going to recede and leave something in its place.
So, that's is a fascinating and large question. Let me zoom way out and maybe I've let me give you some of my just like philosophical foundational thinking. Because you're right, in a sense, I am maybe a doomer. I said I see I mean, I'm American. I see the United States falling apart. I see there, a return, what is it? The Fukuyama, the end of history. I think it's already becoming clear that history is restarting, and like I said, we'll have kings and god emperors, and civilizations will conquer other civilizations. It'll be a very you know chaotic time, perhaps, if all of that comes to pass, and we really return to the ancient ways of the world. A sort of like feudal or even like tribal structure. um I've already said that, like, the positive side of this is that there will be greater exploration. We will find newer and bigger mountain ranges in the cultural landscape. We will be able to get off these local optima, and we might there will be a group of people that stumbles on a new way of life or whatever that is conducive to human flourishing in a way that we hadn't even considered, that was maybe just sitting right there. And we talked about these, maybe somebody stumbles upon something in one of these timed cultural experiments, and then that, just as we see in nature, there's a adaptive radiation where that new cultural mutation spreads throughout the world across any geopolitical borders.
Mm.
So there's in that respect, it might be a positive thing. But you know, when you are in, as we are now, when we are in this, materialist, utilitarian paradigm, I mean, how, on the deepest, moral level, like we are evaluating good and bad in terms of what, like we talk about happiness, we talk about GDP. We inherently are, we have you have people now that say their stated goal is to end all suffering. You have the effective altruists who care about the welfare of shrimp. And I'm not making fun of that, but
Mm,
it's incredibly utilitarian and quantitative. And there are people, they are sort of reducing all value to, the only thing that matters is reducing suffering. And in that respect, extending lifespans. Of course, death is bad. Of course, obviously we should try to extend life as much as humanly possible. We want, of course, we want GDP to go up, and we want to expand throughout the guys. Whatever, you get the point.
mm,
If you're in that framework, your ultimate value sort of has to be quantitative. Um, but in a enchanted religious spiritual mindset, the world is a story or a dream, and maybe if you're Christian, you know how the story ends, you know what the most important part of the story is, and that's true of all the organized religions. But I would say for me, I think we are in a story. We are just as we imagine stories, God is imagining and living through us. We are a thought in the mind of God in some sense, or his dream, as many ancient cultures have speculated. There is a sense, um, and if you adopt that framework, well, it's not clear to me. I can't reduce everything to suffering.
mm,
Um, Aesthetic value is real value to me, and I am not willing in all cases to say that well, this, if we do this or that happens, that's going to be bad because it's going to harm all these people. And maybe in a way it would actually create more beauty in the universe, or it might actually make for a better story, but that doesn't matter. Um, this is all abstract. Let me put it this
mm,
way.
mm.
If When you're thinking of Shane, what do you like in a movie? What makes for a good movie for you?
Oh, it's been so long since I've seen a really good one. I've almost forgotten.
Oh, really? All
Um,
right. Well, we can have a conversation about that. But
um, I guess a really good movie has a lingering transformative effect. Like you leave the theater and something stays with you. It's not just distraction for the time that you're staring at the screen.
do you think that necessarily movies with better special effects and better, high-tech cinematography, are those always better than low-tech movies?
Oh no, 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 no. Recent history has definitely proven
What,
that.
what about movies that last longer? Maybe they never even end.
No,
Movie
no.
lives forever.
There's definitely a sweet spot for duration to get the effect across.
Of
Mm,
course there is. I mean, if the metaphor is not clear, well, yes, I don't think that ending all suffering, or increasing techno-scientific progress until we know everything and can control everything in the universe, I don't think that is a better universe. I don't
mm,
think that's a more meaningful, more ethical universe.
mm,
And I don't know what's going to make for the best story, but I'm sure it's complicated, and there's lots of values that we should be maximizing. And aesthetic beauty is certainly one of them.
mm.
Um, I don't even remember why I started. What was the question? I was
Oh,
gonna connect it.
it was about like what the world could look like if the internet goes away. And I would
Oh,
almost compare the internet to like a giant digestive system that we've thrown all of our culture and information into that we've accumulated over 1,000 years. And now the LLMs are like digesting it down into sludge. And it's almost like
yes,
it's like we've
yes.
burnt down the Library of Alexander. Like all the scrolls are gone, but the building is still there. And we've got blank paper and pens, and we've got an opportunity to write new books to fill the library again.
Right. Well, my you sort of that's a very you characterize me as somewhat of a doomer, which I think is fair, but I would say every good story needs a conflict, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You need a final boss. So, um, you know, hopefully humanity, hopefully the conflict doesn't totally result in the extinction of humanity. But if, like you're saying, we are, suddenly or even gradually thrust back into a pre-digital era, even, I mean, my mind immediately goes to, there's been these science fiction stories where it's post-apocalyptic nuclear war and we're reduced to sticks and stones. And at first, everybody remembers the previous world, and then it has to get passed down in oral culture. And then all of a sudden, after a few generations, well, how after 100, 1,000 generations do people remember and explain the internet?
Mm.
How do they remember and explain uh, AI, LLMs? Well, it seems pretty obvious to me that LLMs just become spirits or
Mm.
gods, and the internet becomes the spirit world, the other side, this non-physical realm where intelligences roamed and acted, and it affected the physical world, and it could have real effects, but it was non-physical. And then people start having mystical experiences where they feel like they talk to God, or they sense a ghost of their ancestor, and it becomes very obvious to them that's what the myth was about.
Hmm. Hmm. I did want us to take a little bit of time, if I can keep you a bit longer. You wrote an amazing article about great organisms, this idea that a single exceptional individual with unusual behaviors or characteristics can transform a whole species, either through behavioral transformation or maybe through genetic contribution that spreads across the entire population. And I wonder if you have any suspicions that this might have happened in human evolution, because anatomical modernity appeared many thousands of years before behavioral modernity. And yeah, I wonder if it was like it's almost like all of the hominins suddenly became goths, and they decided to like paint their face and dress different ways, and different make different kinds of music, and all of that could be traced back to like one very strange individual who decided to start engaging in all those behaviors.
Well, first, we can keep on rolling. I'm have a you've given me a canvas of fascinating questions to just spew ridiculous nonsense that is almost certainly wrong, but hopefully interesting. So
Mm, mm,
we can keep rolling. And I'm about to continue on with this question.
mm,
So the article you're talking about, the great what was it, the great organism theory of evolution,
mm,
just to explain that a little more, I came across this really interesting passage in a oh gosh, what was the book? Is by a guy named David Abram. It's called Becoming Animal. David Abrams. It's a really fascinating book. He is a magician, but he traveled the world learning like indigenous magic from like shamans. And so the becoming animal it's a lot about just the connection to nature, and how shamans, they would go on these, they would meet their spirit animal and bring back knowledge for, how to heal someone, all that stuff, whatever. And he describes how he encountered a lot of stories from people around the world, um, talking about how it was just common knowledge in their tribe that there were sometimes very special animals. There was an elk or a lion or one particular raven that everybody just knew was just different than the rest of them, and
mm,
they would behave in very strange and intelligent ways. And it almost seemed like they were like a representative of their species, and they developed a kind of they developed a symbiotic relationship with this one animal. And they would there and then they would come up with all ideas like, oh, that's their shaman. um or like they but the idea was like there are some animals in any species that are, they didn't use this terminology, but that are essentially geniuses at communicating with other species, or just geniuses in general.
Mm,
um and I found that very fascinating for a few reasons. Obviously I've been sort of pushing back against a lot of scientism here. And so it struck me immediately that this is, science needs a sample size. It can't really deal with the singular, the truly unique.
mm,
And so, we look back at macro evolutionary trends and we could say, oh, this species, it used to be free living, and then they developed a symbiotic relationship with this one species. Or we can tracing back genes and fossils. They used to be vegetarian, and then they became carnivorous. And we just sort of chalk that up to like, there's a lot of time, a lot of mutations, shit happens.
mm,
Um, but evolution has, or science rather, has no way. It is a very real possibility that just as there are, world historical, species changing humans, Jesus, Buddha, Newton, and any number of, whoever you want to choose, Plato, Socrates, Confucius, whatever,
mm,
Muhammad. Um, why wouldn't there be those animals in other species? And when we see a transition, when we see a new symbiotic relationship formed, or a drastic, we have, whales and dolphins used to live on land. Was there just literally one special, a genius, the Einstein of this species, that was able to, it was a very poor environment, and they figured out a new food source. They figured out, we can go into the water,
mm,
and complete trajectory of the species was changed because of one individual, actually. Um, and what would this look like? We would look across, again, macro evolution, and it would just seem like shit's happening, and we're not realizing that there is some, a really singular event that often is changing, the dynamics of a species evolution. Um, so I just, I found that to be a fascinating and interesting thought, and it seems on some level we know this happens in terms of human culture. There was a random carpenter who died at age 33, who's now the most famous human who's ever lived, and has been the cause of endless wars and ideas, and you get the idea.
mm,
Uh,
mm.
I don't remember your was there what was a specific question? I
Well,
got lost in explaining the
I
idea.
wondered if it could be tied to the sudden emergence of behavioral modernity in
Ah,
human evolution.
yes. Um, have you heard of this guy Andrew Cutler and his snake theory of consciousness?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Using snake venom as a hallucinogen in initiations, and
So
that
he
females probably became uh, sentient, sapient first through some kind of secret ritual that they didn't share with the men.
Right. So this it sounds it's less crazy than it sounds there, and there's a lot more details to it. But as far as like I understand it, he is sort of explaining like what you said, like, okay, so we were physically modern for a long time, but we still like had no culture. It was just incredibly primitive, and then there was a kind of explosion of behavioral modernity, which, it seems like in all likelihood, probably, as he says, self-consciousness or sort of modern, self-conscious human, linguistic intellect that can, reason about, I can, I have metacognition, I can think about my thinking and reason about, symbols. He claims that this didn't evolve gradually. There actually was a kind of a snake cult that you see evidence of across the world, and it was connected, like you say, to women at first, and it had something to do with the psychedelic effects of that are caused by some snake venoms, and somebody hallucinated essentially an ego.
Mm,
They hallucinated a new modality of consciousness. They sort of woke up in the self-consciousness, and that it actually was spread to other humans like mimetically, like other humans did this cult, and they became did this snake venom ritual, and they became self-aware, and then they could kind of like teach it to other humans. So I mean that
it's almost like the
whoever,
first step of multiple personality disorder. It's the first split in the
and
primordial
I think
mind, and now it's just
yeah,
normal. But you can
I
do
think
more
he makes
splits on
that
top of
connection.
that if you're an unusual individual.
Right. I think he makes that connection, or somebody has. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly like that. And going back to this, tying back to psychedelics and stress. Stress is often what causes that fracturing of a new ego. And so in this case, it was the stress of being poisoned by this snake led to in this case, the formation of a like a new psychic structure. Um, and so, I mean, to your point, that whoever that the first woman who maybe accidentally, maybe it obviously wasn't, we just got to might have just been bitten by a snake and that it happened, but
Mm.
that was a great organism, that Eve, as we might say.
I mean, it's a little bit like the social contagion of like opiate addiction that one person, uh, you know, accidentally became the first, opium addict, but then they shared that experience with other people, and then it spread and became like a civilizational changing habit.
Yeah, totally. Um, I've heard people even there's one guy who has a theory that alcohol was incredibly important to the foundation of civilization,
Yeah.
and by increasing sociality and creativity and getting us to again sort of relax our beliefs and enter a more childlike state.
I have a similar theory that uh, like rational golden ages are tied to mass caffeine consumption because I think
Oh
you
yeah.
can see similar patterns in ancient China and the Middle East when they adopted tea and coffee drinking. There was a kind of intellectual flourishing because people could, just spend all day staring at scrolls, where normally they wouldn't tolerate doing that.
Right. Which obviously that's in a sense, a lot of what we've been talking about is, what happened, like, civilizationally when a new drug was introduced, and we know that it rippled throughout civilization in sometimes very positive ways. Sort of, can we harness that effect on a micro level to increase our civilizational flexibility and creativity
Mm, mm.
through modern technology, not, all that.
Now, I have a big theory as well that's something I'm obsessed with is that hybridization seems to be a major and underappreciated driver of speciation. And also, horizontal gene transfer happens much more often than we realize. And my theory is that human beings have the potential to become a universal symbiont on planet Earth, changing the evolutionary trajectory of pretty much every other life form that we have around us and ourselves. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on that perspective as someone with a biological background.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything we know about, I mean, the obviously the origin of eukaryotes was a endosymbiotic event.
Mm,
And I'm not, an expert on the literature, but it is my understanding that it it's harder to discover. It's easier to discover a speciation event when, one population moves to an island, and over time they evolve into something different from the mainland population.
mm,
It's a lot harder when there's a kind of cryptic hybridization or gene transfer, but I do believe that modern genomic techniques are allowing, are sort of proving your point that this happens a lot more than we realized. It's just a little bit harder to suss out.
mm,
Um, I mean, in terms of the future and how this might become a more sort of self-directed thing, I wrote about this in one of my wild projections of our sort of digital spiritual future. Um, as a part of, like we talked about this sort of romantic naturalistic turn where sex and death become much more culturally important and maybe spiritualized in a way that they aren't now. Um, I would also see the sort of use of technology, not to sort of control and constrain and master nature, but to help us fuse with it.
mm,
And so what that might look like is, so say you're some eco cult, who in your sort of expressed goals are to return the natural world to a greater level of health and vitality and diversity. Maybe to really really put your money where your mouth is, you undertake various neurological and biological enhancements to become a cat man or a dog man.
mm,
And maybe it's relatively superficial, but maybe it's not. Or maybe you develop just new senses, and there is some way you have of like sort of feeling the health of an ecosystem, or
mm,
when you step into like you step into a healthy ecosystem, and you have some digital enhancement running in your mind that is rapidly assessing, okay, how diverse and how this and that, and this gets translated into like a positive sensation that you feel.
mm,
um uh so all kinds of crazy ways in which we could take use technology to sort of merge and enhance our relationship with nature. I think is interesting and perhaps plausible.
mm. Now, we should probably wrap up. This has been an amazing conversation. And I have a fun question that I like to ask everyone at the end. And I think I have to ask you both versions of this. So the first one, the focus today has mostly been on culture. If you could wave a magic wand and create a new cult or culture or religion, what would you wish into the world?
Okay, obviously I've thought about this. I'll try to keep it relatively brief, and because this is just sort of something always on my mind, and I have goals of, writing my personal Bible. A lot of my thinking here is it's come up in this conversation in various things I've said, and I'll throw out a few just kind of related ideas or frames here. And I wouldn't maybe call it a cult or a religion as much as I don't know, spiritual philosophy, a meta religion,
Hmm.
whatever that would mean. Um, we've talked a little bit about sort of childliness, or just how our culture is, maybe more adult than it's ever been.
Mm,
And one thing that I've always has just kind of always been in my mind, or I think about, is obviously like one of the most famous things Jesus said, like to enter the kingdom of heaven, truly you must be like a little child or something. Um, and Jesus, he said lots of things like praising children and their virtues. And I don't know, that's always just like stuck with me. And that I've maybe explained some of my reasoning here, but is there something that looks like a just a not a childishness where which is more pejorative, but
Mm.
a childliness, I would say, where all of the virtues of the child, which in many ways are completely counter to our very serious 9 to 5 adult world, and even materialism, which would sort of breed uh, as it does, a nihilism, a cynicism, whereas the child, of course, is incredibly innocent, and just open to new experiences, and is, sort of naturally lives in an enchanted world, and, naturally is, sort of naive and open to believing in magic and stories. Like I said, to me, it's, the child can't help but thinking of the world as a story, and can't help they don't really understand how things work, and there's incredible virtue in that. Zen talks about beginner's mind, letting go of what you think so that you can really inhabit the mind of a beginner and see the obvious thing that everyone's missed.
Do you think it's
Or
likely that the equivalent of Jesus in the 21st century will be homeschooled?
I would say that has to be true for them to truly become such a unique thinker and being. Um, and then there's also just like the emperor has no clothes kind of thing, where it's the kid doesn't know the social conventions, and so he can say the obvious
Mm.
thing and can even get away with it. And so like what, how that manifests or what that looks like, I'm maybe not sure, but I've always I guess the thing that fascinates me about Christianity is that, and I'm not the only one obviously to think about this, is that you have the God the Father, you have the authoritarian, the lawgiver, the terrible, the punishing God.
Mm.
You have the Zeus, the Jupiter, and of course all sort of pagan gods are in some sense they are like the Father God, or they are powerful. We should be fearful of them. But in Christianity, that God is also the child. He is weak. He because he gets killed. He's foolish. He apparently Jesus is the Son of God and he could kill the Romans, but he lets himself be killed. Jesus is so much of what he's saying is, love thy enemy. It's incredibly foolish. He is very much about either I don't care about the law, or what, actually, even though I am God, I am the servant. It's the central motif of Jesus's teaching. Not that modern day Christians live this, but it is inversion, and it really is this childless childly foolishness before the world. And so what I could see, or maybe my hope, would be a renewed focus and understanding that I don't know, true spirituality has to be very childish in a way, and that includes a creative and imaginative element. It seems to me, and this is what I talked about, at the very beginning, people not being spiritually ambitious. People are not putting their imagination and creativity, they're putting it into their work, they're putting it into science, they're putting it into all kinds of things, but not really trying to like we've been talking about, create new cults, new ideas, whatever.
Mm.
Um, so I wonder if there is a movement towards something like that. And maybe that does look like, as children become rarer and rarer, the fertility crisis, as we become older and older and we extend our lifespans, does just the child begin to take on an importance in culture that it doesn't now, where and yeah, maybe, yeah, like the next, this maybe involves freeing children from scholastic slavery. Um, and then just the last thing I'll connect this to,
Mm,
which very much dovetails with everything I've been saying. There's this book, which I am not going to exactly remember the name of. It's called like something related to the grasshopper, and it's about games, and it's like the subtitles like games and utopia or something. It was, I think, written in the 70s by some philosopher.
mm,
Um, and the basic premise is pretty simple. It's just like, all right, what is utopia? Well, if everything is truly perfect, there can't be anything wrong. There's nothing to solve. There's no problems, and so in essence, there's no work. There's nothing's wrong. There's nothing to work on. The world doesn't need to be changed anymore.
yeah.
So
Frozen in
then,
time.
right. Well, so then what is reality? What is the world? Well, it has to be pure play. It has to be a game. Um, and he kind of works off from that, but just this idea that paradise, utopia, the kingdom of heaven, it probably feels like everyone is playing the perfect game forever.
Hmm.
Um, and it strikes me that there has to be some truth to that. I mean, I don't know how other people feel, but the closest I feel like I've ever been to heaven is when I am engrossed, when you're in the zone, when you are playing a game and it is encompassing your full being, and your ego and the future and the past fall away, and you are in that flow state. To me, that's is that is it is a touch of heaven, and then you stop playing, and the anxiety about the future and the worry about the past and everything returns, and you slammed back into this purgatory or hell, whichever one we are. um and so I quite like that notion. It's a very kind of childish thing. um and I wonder if there's something like that which we should be aspiring to, and
Mm, mm.
maybe that doesn't mean that we become addicted to video games, but maybe it does just we do try to intensely and seriously, paradoxically, uh, take take play and childhood much more seriously and religiously.
Yeah, yeah, I love that answer. And I'm going to be greedy and I'm going to ask you the question that I normally ask people doing like crop breeding and more biological
Please.
stuff. If you could wave a magic wand and create a new life form, what would you wish into the world?
Oh God. Um, well,
Take your time because I normally let people know this in advance. I only gave you the culture one to think about in advance.
I immediately am thinking about what I just said, obviously. And so is there, um, like I said, in Christianity, God, the perfect being, is a perfect fusion of the Father and the child. He is paradoxically, he is all powerful and all weak, and he and so is there a a creature, it could be a kind of human, maybe it's not even an entirely new species, but do we develop some technology where you retain all the traits of the childhood, the plasticity, the wild openness and adaptability, and it is able to fuse with your adult state. I mean, maybe that's sort of biologically impossible.
Well, have you heard of, I think it's Williams syndrome, where
I
children
have.
have no social anxiety, like they just love everybody that they are coming to contact with, and it comes with other health consequences. It's a complex condition, but that behavioral change is almost magical.
I do know Williams syndrome because Well, I should back up, and this is maybe not a good answer. I would say, how about this? I'm going to turn your question on the head.
Mm,
The species I would create already exists, and it's humans because we already are the incredibly childish ape. And
hmm
as you probably know, um, the history of human evolution is paedomorphism, is the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood.
hmm
Um, and the reason we are so good at learning even as adults is because the sort of plastic, we are plastic as adults, like chimpanzees are only as infants. And that's why we're hairless. And you look at infant chimpanzees, they're actually bipedal in a way that the adults aren't. And I could go on and on. Um, but this has been the course of human evolution, has been a retention of juvenile traits into adulthood.
hmm
Um, and this, explains so many aspects of our biology. And I bring this up now because Williams syndrome, there's studies, and a lot of the same regions that are affected in Williams syndrome, the same genomic regions where we see like deletions and mutations, those are our hotspots of recent evolution.
mm,
Um, Supporting this idea, yeah, that the Williams syndrome is a kind of hyperpaedomorphic phenotype. They are sort of more childish in some ways, and they have all kind of verbal deficits, but they do have. I'm forgetting this. There are some like weird ways in which they are better than normal humans.
I
Uh,
believe their like emotional intelligence metrics are higher than average, that they pick up on things through empathy and social signaling that a lot of neurotypical people don't.
Yes, which, again, it supports that theory that, humans have evolved in that direction, more empathetic and less violent and more just socially aware than our ancestors. Um, and so I don't know what would it look like to, if we were all more like Williams syndrome or something to that effect.
I love that answer. Making humans more human is,
Yeah,
or
that's
more
really what I'm
or
saying.
postmodern humans.
Yeah, like everything that we our greatest strengths and our greatest weaknesses are, kind of tied together, and let's just kick it into overdrive. Let's go even further.
Yeah, see where it takes us. Let's play an experiment. I love it. Now, where can people find more of your work? And I highly recommend people check out your writing.
Yeah, so my blog is secretorum.life is there you go, very fitting web address. Um, and the name I write under is Rogers Bacon. So if you search like Secretorum Rogers Bacon, it'll show up. It's just a Substack blog. I'm uh, perhaps not writing as much as I did, but still thinking and chipping away. And I would say that's the main place to follow me. And then I also am the kind of editor and manager of Seeds of Science. If you just Google, I say Seeds of Science Substack, it should show up. And it's a science blog, but I am, as is, if you listen to this and made it through, well, God bless you. But you could tell that I'm interested in the more radical and speculative side of things. So I try to post some interesting essays that try to go off the beaten path or outside the box. So if you just check out those two sites, you'll see all about my work.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for what's been a really fascinating conversation. I so rarely get to talk about these topics, and yeah, I've really enjoyed the opportunity.
Can't thank you enough, Shane. It was a blast. Let's do it again.
If you'd like to read more, subscribe for free weekly posts at my Substack at Recombination Nation. A paid subscription will unlock the archive of past posts and supports all the work I'm doing on my experimental farm. Next week, we have a 2-for-1 interview with Julia Dakin and Anna Mayeritz from the Going to Seed organisation. They've been building up this organisation to bring adaptation gardening to communities across the United States.